Thank you all for being here today as we talk about valuing community-based research. Today, we will be thinking about the ways that we can engage communities within the projects that we do. I'll be talking most specifically about like deep community engagement. And I also know that's not necessarily a modality that works for everyone's research. And so, I'm holding that. And what I encourage you all to think about, if you're already like, wow, I do really basic research, I don't work with communities, is to maybe use this as an opportunity to think about the research communities that you're engaged with and how you might maybe deepen your connection to those communities or broaden those communities to work more with people, say, like that may see the impacts of your research. And so, so keep that in mind as we go. If that I think this still does apply to everyone. You may just need to think more about like what community means for you. But if you are doing research that does directly impact, lived communities, current communities, then I think this will be very applicable as we go along. Okay, so what we'll be talking about today, as always, we'll start with some foundational concepts. I'll be laying out some different models of community research, and then we'll have some discussion questions and closing. Oh, and I will within here too also be providing some examples of next steps that past participants have done that I think can help you all to think about what you might do after this program ends and how you can kind of keep this work going. Okay, so the foundational concepts that we're going to be talking about today, one is the matrix of domination. That's something, as you know, we're revisiting. We've talked about this before. And the second is the concept of models of participation. I put up this image created by Joanna Varon that I think is really great, that kind of demonstrates the relationship between power and intersectionality. So in a sense, between the matrix of domination and by Patricia Hill Collins and intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. So you can kind of see how they've made this chart where, we see at the intersection of capitalism and colonialism, we see disability and class. At the intersection of white supremacy and colonialism, we see race, nationality, and religion. Where heteropatriarchy and white supremacy meet, we see gender and physical appearance. And finally, at the intersection of capitalism and heteropatriarchy, we list other factors in education and sexuality. So, I mean, this is sort of meant to, kind of demonstrate the interconnected nature of all of these things. So while they're sort of like sectioned out, the reality is these are all intertwined. But I just think it's a nice way to think about them both as intertwined while also thinking about them in their own specificity, because both of those things are actually really, really helpful to the research we do. Coming back to the concept of matrix of domination, the particular way I'd like for us to think about this today is thinking about how oppression operates at 3 different levels. 1 on the personal level, 2 at the communal level, and 3 at the institutional level. When we're doing our research, we may be operating at 1 or more of these levels. One of the things that tends to differentiate more deeply engaged community work is there is at minimum an acknowledgement of oppression at all these levels, including and very importantly at the institutional level, and ideally interventions happening at these different levels, particularly the institutional. It's often within community-based work, particularly when working with communities who have been historically neglected, to acknowledge the institutional nature of oppression. So the other term I want us to kind of think about as we move through this is one called models of participation. So I've created this sort of little triangle here adapted from a combination of Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which is kind of like a classic of planning, and much more recent work by Sasha Costanza-Chalk in her book, Design Justice. I highly recommend this book for anyone that is engaged in any form of design and community-based work. It's just a really phenomenal read, and phenomenal that they present some phenomenal models. So what you can see here is in the sort of bottom two corners of this triangle, we see two ways that public engagement has often happened and often still happens. One is through what I would call extraction and exploitation. In this model, this is sort of like the example people talk about of researchers kind of parachuting in and then leaving, and the community, really nothing changes with the community, or there's even the possibility that they're worse off than they were before. So that's one model of participation that I definitely would say we want to avoid. We want to avoid a model where we're essentially just taking things from the community, taking their time, taking their resources, taking their knowledge, and not actually providing any material benefit to them. On the other side at the bottom there, I have listed manipulation and degradation. There, what I like to think, what I see is the sort of like community engagement where somebody just kind of comes in and tells communities what is good for them, what they need, what the solutions are, what their problems are. It's manipulative because it's the solutions have already been determined by the quote unquote expert coming into the community. And they're acting as if there's engagement, but actually no, the point of engagement is to convince them around the solutions that you, the expert, have already deemed appropriate. And that's a manipulative move. I say this is also degrading because there is this idea that the community doesn't know what's best for them. There's a condescension, there sort of is a degradation of that community's own knowledge as not worth listening to, not worth people's time. And if they have different opinions, they're actually implicitly wrong. And the goal is just to get them on the right page, which is the page that the expert is on. And so both of these are models. One is one that kind of does, you could say, value community knowledge, but because yes, it takes knowledge from the community, but it's not respectful in that it's not an equal exchange. And the other, it does not respect community knowledge and is attempting to give something that the community may not actually want. So instead, these other two parts of the triangle are ones that are working closer towards an equal exchange. We see that above that, I have this inverted triangle of informing and consulting. There, that may be one where a researcher or a quote unquote expert will work to inform the community of, say, particular changes happening, or some new scientific findings that may be relevant to them, in order to hopefully engage in a conversation or to help them to have information so they can better make their own decisions. This may also look like consulting. Consulting may be where, for example, you are coming into, say, hold some focus groups, but you're also like compensating them. You're going to report back on the research results. You're providing support so they can make it with, like, food and childcare. And so this is better. This is sort of like a model where there is respect for the community's expertise and knowledge and their time. And there's a movement towards the idea of an equal exchange. But it does still oftentimes still kind of like preserve a relationship where the researcher or expert is sort of setting the terms of the relationship. And then at the top, we have a triangle where I've put shared power and partnership. And that is one where there's actually sort of like a true relationship and collaboration between the community and the researcher. And so there may be, the community will have, say, an active part in even determining what research questions are asked and what sort of methods are used. It's more of like the community teaching the researcher and the researcher teaching the community, them talking with each other to actually determine what the best course of action for the research project will be. And there's dialogue throughout the process of research. It's not sort of like just at the beginning or just at the end. It's through the process. And a lot of the work I'll be talking about here is kind of at that top tier. But again, if we just want to move more towards, more of a genuine relationship. And again, if you're not doing work with communities, I encourage you to think about this in the communities as we typically think of it, like sort of like a public neighborhood or a city or something like that, or, grassroots organization. Maybe think instead about other like related groups of people, other, say research communities that you may wish to engage with, or even who are the communities already present within your research that maybe you don't attend to as closely. One person shared actually from one facilitator shared from last year that they found that some of their participants actually thought of their lab animals as part of the community to which they wanted to be more responsible. So that's also an interesting model to think to. Now I'm going to kind of go through some different examples of community-based research. And I think one of the first things we want to establish is that communities already do their own research, and they actually have been for some time. So for example, the Black Panthers were, in the 70s doing a lot of work within the realm of public health, and actually in some ways, pioneering new ways of doing public health within the Black community. We also saw many environmental justice advocates of the past and the present doing their own scientific research, doing things such as assessing the toxins within their community and their health impacts. And so these are forms of research that communities already engage in, and this may already again be happening in places where you may want to do your work or you may be doing your work. So it's always important to keep that in mind. Another really powerful framework for community-based research is called Liberatory Methodologies. This is a methodology that was pioneered by Vajra Watson, who sort of talks about how to do research with community level interventions. And this is a great model, I think, for many types of research: health disparity, environmental justice, planning and transportation, food access or food sovereignty, many others. These questions can be really powerful, I think, for us to answer. They are, one, what is it that you really want to know about? Why do you want to know it? Where does your curiosity come from? What will you do with your findings? And who is your research for and why? These are questions all of us can answer. And what I invite in the reflection is to think about how the matrix of you are interacting with the matrix of domination, which with your own intersectional identity or the identity of others, in your answers to these questions. To what extent are your answers to these questions reflective of your own lived experience, which is fine, but what's really important is to recognize what we know and what we don't know. So that's what I like about these questions. They really help us to see what we know, and then we can reflect on what we don't know. One area that I know I feel very out of touch with in terms of what I don't know is what is important to youth. And so if one is involved with research that impacts youth, it can be really powerful to involve youth in the research process. And we're really fortunate that we have this amazing project at UC Davis that provides a wonderful guideline for how to do youth participatory action research. And you can see there's like these 9 stepping stones, and you can essentially enter into the process at any one of these points or go through all of them. So I really recommend checking out their website. You can see it in the chat, and it's also in the enrichment materials on Canvas. What's great about this is that the research can be motivated by the problems, and the potential solutions are generated by the youth. And it's often experienced as a form of empowerment for the youth taking part. I think of a project that I studied having to do with transportation planning, where they involved some local youth in doing surveys and short interviews with community members, and they got youth within the community to do it. And these were youth that were coming from, you know, a historically neglected community. And it was really amazing for them because they realized, wow, like I'm collecting information, I'm doing analysis that is going to actually impact what my neighborhood looks like. And there's millions of dollars that is going to be invested based on what we find. And those youth just, it kind of just like blew their minds, and they're like, and sort of like opened them up to the ways they can actually have an impact on the environment around them. That can be super powerful. And, you know, if that's something that you feel like you could engage in your research, I really encourage you to look up their resources. And then more broadly, there's community-based participatory action, or just community-based participatory research. And in this model, the community at large is an active participant with the researcher. They are guiding research questions. There is an ongoing process of consent between the researcher and the community to do any kind of human research. As we know, we go through the institutional review board. The institutional review board is very important. It also is limited in that consent is limited to the individual. These methodologies and more researchers, including researchers within Indigenous communities, are pointing towards is the importance of ongoing consent and ongoing dialogue. And so at any point, the community may say, actually, no, we were on board with that, but we're not on board with this. Or these potential results that are surfacing actually could harm us more. Or these are knowledges that you're accessing that actually are not for public consumption. That is also something that may often happen within research with Indigenous tribes. And ideally also in this process, the results have a direct outcome on the communities. Oh, sorry, I didn't see those questions before. Youth, I think I think that kind of varies. I think Serena's definition is reasonable. I'd say I'd look at the materials and kind of define. That's not an area that I've done a ton of research in, though I've just studied others doing that research. So thank you all for your thoughts on that. So the community-based participatory research, I want to give one example, which is we have a lot of researchers doing really phenomenal research around this. One example is the research of Claire Cannon doing research and doing work in Kettleman City, which is where this picture is from. We're at a community that is subject to quite a number of different environmental injustices. And she's working with them to actually, figure out how can they demonstrably improve their living conditions, and is very much taking her research direction from things they want to know, which has also consequently required her to do much more transdisciplinary research work. I'll be talking more about that in a few weeks. I also want to highlight the work of Dr. Wynn and Dr. Wynn at the Center for Transformative Justice in Education. They are really working to change the educational systems, both locally and more broadly, to account for historic inequities and to rectify those and to create more space for youth and their lived experience in our current educational institutions. And they do a lot of work in the Sacramento schools as well. So we have lots of great projects that are happening here. Another model I wanted to mention that I know some of the fellows have participated in is the Feminist Science Shop. In this case, the partnerships are often based in a shared commitment to social justice and shared values. And there's often also a need to be very clear about the assumptions during the collaboration. And I'd say this is true of any sort of collaboration with communities. The interests and needs and demands of academic research do not always align well with the needs of a community. And it's really, really important to be clear and honest about that and decide what you can and can't do. Because that essentially is more of a setup for success. And in some cases, research is not the answer actually to community need. Sometimes the answer is different forms of advocacy or other forms of activism. And it's important to account for that too, that research is often helpful, but not necessarily always the answer. The last sort of methodology I wanted to mention is community or citizen science. And this is a methodology that involves the public in data collection and or analysis. We have a whole Center for Community and Citizen Science here that you can learn a lot more about this from. And this may require varying levels of training or direct engagement. It can be either top down, in other words, the researchers are sort of stating the questions, or it could be bottom up. The community may be stating the questions. For example, like communities may say, we want to be able to measure our own air quality on a day-by-day basis. And so then, they work with air quality experts to get sensors, at key locations. So that's more example of a, bottom-up desire for community science. And so with all these examples, I'd encourage you now to think about who is your community? And I listed just some examples here, particularly for those that may be doing research that doesn't directly involve communities, or maybe you'd like to do that work in the future, but in your current position, that's not a possibility. So instead, I invite you to reflect on who is in your community that you could sort of, apply some of these concepts to. Is it your lab? Is it your research animals? Is it working with fellow graduate students or researchers in your field? Could it be future beneficiaries, like who's going to benefit from your work down the line? Or ideally, eventually, who are you doing this research for? Or who are the current beneficiaries? This may be people you're directly impacting right now. It may just be current beneficiaries, people that are getting paid off a grant. That's a benefit of research, is being able to have a paycheck, and that's really important. Now I'm kind of pivoting from, this conversation about doing community engaged research to thinking about what types of interventions you all may want to do in applying the lessons we've been learning this quarter, because hopefully you're all working on your action plans, and I anticipate you'll continue to work on them today in your small groups. I was getting feedback from a number of the facilitators that some examples would be really helpful to you all. So what I decided to do is I looked back at our past evaluation and I pulled out some examples of what people answered when we asked them, what is your next step? What are you going to do next? Because there were really some wonderful and compelling examples. One place that people were going to take a next step was in changing their lab culture. So you see one person said, one of the steps I've taken is integrating the topics from ADQ into biweekly lab meetings with my coworkers. We've had discussions about these topics and will continue learning into 2021. In addition, my professor has opened up opportunities for all of us to rethink the value and mission of our research as a lab. So that's a really concrete thing. This is another similar example of changing lab culture. We've already created new hierarchical structures within our lab group and set up workshops every other week to address issues in science such as race, gender, identity, and equity. By asking for feedbacks and suggestions from our lab mates, we are going to continue to build a more inclusive environment in which we can hopefully be an example for others on campus. And so this person is also thinking about how what they do can serve as a model for others as well. Another next step that people listed was changing their research in some way. So you see one person said, I want to work to make my dissertation data set more inclusive of the people that are most impacted by the disease I study, not only by the people typically studied in my field, white males. I also want to expand my research to include more feminist theory. And so that may be an outcome, is sort of some shift in still, doing your same research, but maybe shifting a little bit how you do it to be more inclusive, or to engage in new sort of theoretical models. Someone kind of talked about how they were going to rethink the way they do service work. So this person says, I am actively recruiting and nominating underrepresented groups into leadership positions, and I'm planning to keep my role as a privileged person at max to a secretary treasurer level. And so they're sort of saying they're actively going to kind of step back from leadership and work on promoting those who have historically been excluded from leadership roles within their field. We saw people talk about making changes to their teaching. So one person said, I will be revising the lecture on historic microbiology to include more information about Indigenous science erasure and to make the perspective less Eurocentric. And someone else said, I would like to apply these frameworks for my teaching of science, particularly those of making more accurate knowledge and addressing colonialism in science. I want to begin by incorporating the framework of perspective as opposed to objectivity and Indigenous knowledge into the syllabus and discussion sections. So again, very like concrete actions they plan on taking. Others talked about a more broader culture change within their field they'd like to enact. So this person says, I am going to reach out to colleagues and develop a network or community of practice around issues of equity in my field. I am hoping to develop a network of young professionals to build a parallel structure to proactively build the type of research and industry that is more just and equitable. So sort of like creating the framework for some form of broader change. And then finally, the last one I'm gonna highlight is someone said, there are 5 students in my program who participated in ADQ this quarter. We plan to get together and discuss what we learned and develop either a workshop for our department or a proposal to help combat the legacies of colonialism within our department. And so kind of, move out, organize to share what they've learned with others. And so to just kind of like summarize some ideas that can spur your own thoughts about what kind of action plans you can take moving from your vision and the challenges to a specific action and goal. You could think about changing your teaching. You could think about having lab group or some form of research community discussions. You could think about making a lab handbook, increasing transparency. That was a big one that I didn't quite highlight there, but was also really important for a lot of people, is just having transparency around the processes can lead to more equity. People may think about diversifying their research impact, in other words, like shifting the question, shifting who you study, shifting the frameworks from which you think about and do your analyses. You could think about creating a network of support for yourself doing that research and for others who share similar values, create an ongoing conversation. You may think about planning further trainings. This is something, a number of people have done, is kind of taking units that we've done and worked on thinking about how they could bring that to a new audience. And finally, just, generally organizing for change. So maybe like some people have, formed groups where they've gone to their departments and said, asked for certain changes that they feel like would lead to greater equity in their department. So lots of different ideas. I hope this kind of like, gets your wheels turning of ideas of what you could do. And I just want to leave you to think about these last things. One is that research work can be movement work. I know I've said this before, but I just want to like reinforce it, that this is true and this is so important. Movement work is a collective action towards change. And so, many of us are working towards change. We think about the urgencies of climate change right now, and, very important meetings happening right now, discussing that and how, we want to be maybe a part of that. That is movement work. But what's really important to remember is that trust is key. I picked this picture here to reference one of the ideas from a book, Emergent Strategy, which is sort of about, how to do movement work. And they have a theory of murmurations. So all those birds, and I apologize if there's any like ornithologists here and I'm explaining this wrong. This is metaphor, but each bird is sort of moving in tandem with the ones closest to them. And they may or may not actually know what the broader configuration looks like. But what they do know is say those 7 birds closest to them. And similarly, I think we can think about our own role in movement work, that we just want to work with, say, the 7 people around us that we trust. And we don't necessarily need to see or do everything. We just know the piece that we're doing, and we work in collaboration with those people who are working in collaboration with more people, who are working in collaboration with more people. And that is sort of like, what we're going for. Questions, I want to bring these questions up again because I think they're great ones for discussion. Reflect on what is it you really want to know about? Why do you want to know it? Where does your curiosity come from? What will you do with your findings? And who is your research for and why? And And these are also in the slides in Canvas if you want to reference this during your discussion. This kind of, first one reiterates the last slide. I also invite you to think about how you might collaborate with communities more deeply in your research. I invite you to reflect on where is your research investing, building capacity and resourcing. And finally, what work would you need to do to be a better partner in your current community? And that, again, can be either a specific external community, like traditionally external community from the academia, or it may be an internal academic community. Closing thoughts. Please attend to how your research methods are situated in the matrix of domination. Think through how you can deepen your model of engagement. And always remember that research can be movement work. So thank you all. Next week, we'll be talking about militarism, surveillance, and academic research. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Have great discussions.